So continuing our discussions on DC Rebirth, we pick up now with Lois Lane versus versus Superwoman. And I absolutely love this comic. My God, the art in this is beautiful, the storytelling's beautiful. Dan Jurgens is hitting every mark. I will say from now until if it ever happens to drop off, Action Comics and Superman are some of the best titles coming out of DC Rebirth right now. I mean, any number of these panels look like something you could just frame on a poster in a room somewhere. But what we do is we initially pick up with Lois Lane, and Lois Lane returning to the Daily Planet. Now keep in mind, this is the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, and the entire reason why she's here is to basically follow up on a situation with the New 52 Lois Lane. Now, Dan Jurgens kind of bounces back and forth between the past and the present, but he does it in a way that makes sense. It's not a constant fluctuation. It's not something where you switch back every other page. Instead, he initially just gives us, the pre-New 52 Lois Lane's arrival here, and the fact that she's not really sure how to interact with things. And the reason why is because there are some characters that she immediately recognizes. Jimmy Olsen here in the New 52, in terms of physical appearance, or at the very least, in terms of his mannerisms, is almost identical to the pre-New 52 Jimmy Olsen. And so this pre-New 52 Lois Lane recognizes him right off the bat. But then there's also new characters that were introduced in the New 52, like Jackie, a character that did not exist in the pre-New 52 universe. And so this pre-New 52 Lois Lane doesn't know who she is. But one of the cool things that Dan Jurgens does here is he focuses so much on character. And that's why I love his run of Action Comics and Superman so much, because what he basically says here is that for Lois Lane, because she's so intelligent, because she was such a phenomenal reporter in the pre-New 52 landscape, she basically allows those around her to answer the questions that she needs answered. And so what she does is she basically just allows Jimmy Olsen to talk, and when he does, he mentions or he references this girl's name as being Jackie, which allows, of course, Lois Lane to know this person's identity. Not only that, we also have a guy named Steve Lombard make an appearance. Now, this is an interesting scenario here, because something I hope you notice is that Steve Lombard bears a striking resemblance to the guy with the hat that we'll see at the end of this comic. I wouldn't swear it as being an absolute truth, but they seem to be closely intertwined with one another. But the fact remains that Steve Lombard also existed in the pre-New 52 continuity, and in that timeline, he was just as much of a dick as he is now in the New 52. And so because of that, Lois Lane is just kind of like, all right, he's the same as he ever was, and she knows how to interact with him in terms of telling him to run off, get out of there, leave her alone, that kind of thing. And so for her, at this point, it's really more navigating these uncharted waters without anybody realizing that she's not the New 52 Lois Lane. Now, the reason for this is largely covered in the Superwoman issue #1 series. Now, we'll get more into this explanation because Dan Jurgens does a really good job of actually just filling us in. And that's one of the reasons, one of the other reasons why I think he does a good job with this, because it'd be very easy for him to not answer that question. It'd be very easy for him to just ignore that. Even though this ties into that, it'd be very easy for him to just throw a caption that says, check out Superwoman #1 for the answer. Instead, he doesn't do that. And that's the great thing about DC Rebirth is all these comics, all these story arcs are designed to basically give new fans a jumping off point. Instead of saying, if you want to know what's going on, you got to start all the way from the beginning, DC is very much taking the Valiant Comics approach here, in the sense that with Valiant Comics, for example, Ninjak, Harbinger, Exo-Man of War, all those stories, you can pretty much jump in at any story arc and know exactly what's going on. DC seems to be copying or taking this format and throwing it into their line of publications, and is working out extremely well. But with the arrival here of Lois Lane, of course, again, she's just encountering various people. She's meeting various people. When she goes into the office of Perry White, before we see what's on the other side of that door, we basically jump back. And what we find out is that this pre-New 52 Lois Lane has been experiencing a series of dreams. These dreams seem to center on the New 52 Lois Lane. Now, these dreams are very cryptic. The pre-New 52 Lois Lane doesn't really know what they mean. She doesn't really know what it all stands for. And even during this beautiful segment in the story, when she's flying with, or I guess she's being carried by Superman, by her husband, and being taken around, the idea here is he's basically, doing his best to kind of provide some measure of comfort to her, in the sense that the Geneticron building, for example, vanished, something that was covered in my video on Action Comics, Who is Clark Kent. But this building's vanished. They're trying to find out what's going on, but the role of Superman here is really more to be a comfort to his wife, that if Lois Lane is having these dreams, and these dreams seem so real, then the only thing thing that she can really do, the only step that she can really take to figure out what's going on with the New 52 Lois Lane is to become the New 52 Lois Lane. Now, this is very, very murky water here, because despite, how she may interact, despite the fact that she's a strong woman who sometimes will do questionable things in order to ensure that justice is seen, one of the greatest aspects about the pre-New 52 Lois Lane's strength of character is that she will take the steps necessary, but she also has a moral compass. There are lines that she's just not willing to cross. Not only that, for her, it just seems weird. It just seems strange. But the cool thing about this, though, is that Dan Jurgens also doesn't forget the small things. With regards to the current run of Superman, I would say one of the standout stars of DC Rebirth is Jonathan Kent, is the son of Superman and Lois Lane, because he has so much character. He's rambunctious, he's fun, he's a kid, he's enjoying life, but while he has these powers, he is also just a 9-10-year-old kid. He's a young boy, and in fact, when we talked about, Return to Dinosaur Island, there was a really good segment where Superman told his son, he said, I keep forgetting with how strong you are, how smart you are, all these powers you have, that you are only just 10 years old. It's things like that that make this story so great. But again, shifting back to Lois Lane and to Superman, one of the other cool things that Dan Jurgens focuses on is the fact that Superman right now, this pre-New 52 Superman in the New 52 landscape, does not have the identity of Clark Kent to fall back on, because there is a human Clark Kent here. Now, while I'm sure that Dan Jurgens introduced this concept for the purpose of a much larger story that will unfold later on, a benefit of this is that this traditional secret identity that we're used to with Superman throwing on glasses and a business suit and so on and so forth is not available to him. And so he has to find other means to keep his identity hidden. Of course, he wears a hat, he wears a coat, so people don't really recognize his face, but more so than that, he can't just walk out onto the street now. He can't just go to the grocery store with Lois Lane right now, because if he did, people would immediately recognize him as being Superman. Because of the fact that there are people out there that still don't trust him, because there are unknown villains out there that Superman doesn't know about but would seek to harm him and those around him, in order to keep his family safe, he basically keeps his identity protected in order to protect them. Now, having said that, of course, during their discussion, the pre-New 52 Lois Lane draws out a letter that she was given by the New 52 Lois Lane. And the letter, again, is very, very cryptic. It basically just says that Perry White had asked the New 52 Lois Lane to write a story in honor of the New 52 Superman who died, and that Lois Lane was working on that. But then there's also this little segment at the bottom that does two things. The first is it provides a very ominous statement in the sense that if something happens to her, to the New 52 Lois Lane, that the pre-New 52 Lois Lane will take it up for her. The other half is that it has a password at the bottom. Now, this presents a very big question. The biggest question to ask is, how does the New 52 Lois Lane know about the pre-New 52 Lois Lane? Well, the answer to that question comes again in the Superwoman line of stories, but we'll follow up with that once we get towards the conclusion of this video. But the fact remains is, is that, again, this character, I can't keep harping on this enough. The character element of Dan Jurgens' writing makes the story great. The jokes between Superman and his wife, the fact that Lois Lane says, how can I possibly just walk into the Daily Planet? And Clark Kent says, hey, just throw on Superman just says, hey, throw on a black wig and some sunglasses. It'll be really inconspicuous. Nobody will know. Of course, that's the joke, that it would be very conspicuous, but he's basically kind of making a joke of the underlying theme. The two of you look almost identical. If you were to walk in there, no one would know the difference. They would see you and they would see Lois Lane. They don't know that she's from the pre-New 52 timeline and made their way into the New 52 by virtue of the convergence event. They don't know that the New 52 Lois Lane is, well, we'll get to that in a little bit. But the fact remains here that, it's for Lois Lane to simply just go in, or I guess for Superman, it's go in, pretend to be Lois Lane, and get the answers that you're looking for. Now, transitioning back to the present moment, when we follow up with Lois Lane at the Daily Planet and when she gets into the office, the reason why she was shocked is because Lex Luthor is currently running the Daily Planet. Now, Lois Lane didn't know this. The pre-New 52 Lois Lane wasn't aware of this, and a lot of this is because of the fact that as, with Superman trying to keep them safe, he's also kept them very isolated from the rest of the world. Now, it does help, it does work, because Lois Lane can be a stay-at-home mom. She can make sure that Jonathan Kent gets the kind of life lessons that he needs in order to become a productive member of society. She's very much a housewife sort of person, but it's not by choice, it's by circumstance. And the reason why that worked so well is because that's not who Lois Lane is. The pre-New 52 Lois Lane is not a housewife. She doesn't sit at home baking bread and cleaning the house, waiting for her husband to get home. It creates a fun situation, but in the back of our minds as comic book fans, we always knew that that was going to change. We always knew that the pre-New 52 Lois Lane would move on to being that strong, confident woman that we know, and she would take up the mantle of, at some point, quite possibly returning to the Daily Planet. And so when she gets here, of course, the idea is, or I guess the first question asked from Perry White is, where's the paper you were supposed to write on Superman? And of course, Lois Lane plays this off really well. She says, well, it's writer's block, you know, I'm trying to get it figured out, yada, yada, yada. And she does a really good job of doing this, simply because she is so cunning and she is so smart. But there's also some indication here from Dan Jurgens that Lex Luthor knows what's going on. Now, this is not explicitly stated. You know, it's not stated Lex Luthor secretly knows everything that's going on behind the scenes. It's just by virtue of how it is that he looks, you know, how he looks at her. It's by virtue of the kind of answers that he gives, different things like that. But, you know, it's a really cool situation. But the other side of this is that with the real Superman, as people refer to him, as the pre-New 52 Superman being in this landscape and being the superhero, being part of the Justice League, Lex Luthor is still looked at with a skewed eye. And what I mean by this is that in the New 52, Lex Luthor was very much, you know, in the ways of kind of being a villain, but not being a villain. You know, for example, in Forever Evil, he saved the world, but people still look at him as being, you know, a villain of Superman. But when the New 52 Superman died, Lex Luthor donned some armor and became that Superman. And so there was a lot of contention, there was a lot of debate, you know, among general society, who's actually Superman here? Is it Lex Luthor, or is it this Superman, you know, the pre-New 52 Superman, the one that doesn't require armor? Which one is which? And so as a result of this, you know, of course, Lois Lane plays on this situation where she talks to them and so on and so forth. But the idea is that Lex Luthor wants her to write a piece that will basically tell the world who he is at his core, will tell the world what it is that he's about. And so again, as we have Lois Lane leaving the office of Perry White, for the first time, she encounters this human Clark Kent. And again, this feeds into the video that I have that you'll find down in the description on Superman meeting Clark Kent. But remember, this is not Superman. This Clark Kent is not Superman. It's not the New 52 Superman. It is literally a human being named Clark Kent. Now again, that's all part of the bigger story arc that Dan Jurgens is writing here, but this is the first time Lois Lane has met him, and for her, it's very jarring, you know, just because of the fact that when she thinks Clark Kent, she thinks of her husband. She doesn't think of just some random guy who looks just like her husband. And so it's a very striking situation, but she plays this off pretty well, you know, in the sense that she basically says, hey, look, you know, I'm here to work on an assignment. I don't have a whole lot of time to talk to you, but her goal is to access the computer of Lois Lane for the purpose of yanking up whatever, you know, documentation she can on why Lois Lane had vanished using the password that she was given. But because of the fact that this version of Clark Kent is still clumsy, because of the fact that this version of Clark Kent is still a capable person, but is also overwhelmed by the situation, the result is that he spills coffee on the computer and destroys it. And so what this does is this gives Lois Lane a chance to go back to the apartment of the New 52 Lois Lane and investigate even further, after realizing that if this New 52 Lois Lane was anything like herself, she would have had a laptop at home with all her personal files that would have remained safe and away from those individuals who would have been able to hack into and access the Daily Planet. And so what happens here is when she gets back, she's immediately met by the arrival of Superwoman. Now this is cool because my initial thought before because I hadn't picked up Superwoman at the time when I was going through this comic. I hadn't picked up, you know, everything that was going on. And so my initial thought was that, hey, like if this is Superwoman, then this must be Lois Lane. But the immediate indication here, or what the Superwoman says, is that you're not her. You're not Lois Lane, so why are you here? Now, of course, this tells us that is not Lois Lane. This tells us that's not the case. Whoever this woman is certainly not her. But before we find that out, what we do here is we jump back to the pre-New 52 Superman along with his son, Jonathan Kent. Now, this seemed to come out of left field. This really seemed to come out of nowhere, but it didn't. You know, Dan Jurgens did a really, really good job, again, focusing on character here. He does a great job of including the fact that everything is changing and that change is not necessarily bad. Now, to be honest, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a comic book fan that would say, well, this current, you know, this Superman Rebirth thing is garbage, this is bad. I think most people will universally agree that the Superman stories right now in DC Rebirth are nothing short of fantastic. But, you know, for Superman, he's teaching his son, you know, about his powers. He's teaching his son, you know, how to use like telescopic vision, different things like that. But it's also Dan Jurgens telling us that Jonathan Kent does not have all the same powers as his father just yet. For example, he doesn't have X-ray vision. You know, he's fast, but he doesn't have the same kind of powers that his father has. Not only that, again, Jonathan Kent is still just a boy. And so when he gets home, he calls out for his mom, he calls out for Lois, and he says, hey, I'm home, and he's excited to tell her that he raced his father and beat him home. Of course, we know that Superman allowed him to win. But there's also a few jokes here. There's also a few things that, that really set the tone for the direction that these stories are going in. For example, when Jonathan has a hard time dealing with the fact that Lois isn't there. When his father says, well, your mother's still at the Daily Planet, she's probably working, he's sad about this situation. And Superman says, this will probably happen more often. It'll probably get to the point where your mother will be working at the Daily Planet. And because of that, she's not going to be home as often as she used to be. Now, this is a hard adjustment for Jonathan because, again, despite the fact that he's wildly powerful, despite the fact that, woe betide the poor soul that tries to attack him, he's still just a kid. He has the mind of a kid. And for him, he's used to his mom being home. And the fact that when he gets home, his mom's not there is a crushing sensation for him. But it's also a realization that things change and that he's going to have to get used to that change. That is why I think this story's written so well, because it's the small things, it's the really small things that Dan Jurgens focuses on that makes the story so good. But picking back up again with Lois Lane and her encounter with Superwoman, again, the situation is pressured, on Lois Lane. She says, you're not Lois Lane. Superwoman says, you are not her. Why are you here? Now, we know by virtue of just Superwoman being who she is, she could easily punch a hole through Lois Lane and kill her on the spot, no questions asked. And Lois Lane knows this. Lois Lane knows how easily she could be killed in this situation. But she also is a woman that's very capable. And so what she does is use her resources to her advantage, and she basically calls home. Now, the reason why this is important is because even if her husband, even if Superman doesn't pick up, his super hearing would let him know exactly what's going on if he even overheard a fraction of the conversation. But that's not really even necessary here. And the reason why is because Jonathan answers the phone, he hears his mother talking, and just by virtue of what she's saying, he tells, Superman, I think mom's in trouble. Superman's off to the races. I mean, he's gone in the blink of an eye, tells his son, stay here, and he's off to go figure out what's going on with Lois Lane. Now, when he gets there, of course, the question he has is, who are you? Why are you threatening my wife? And Superwoman reveals herself to be Lana Lang. Now, for those of you guys who have not been reading the Superwoman story, and I hadn't even really been reading it. I think I skimmed, maybe the first few pages of the story arc, and then I ended up just going to Action Comics and Superman and reading that instead. If you're currently not reading Superwoman, you are missing out. It is a great story. And Lana Lang basically covers the events of the first issue for us. Dan Jurgens does a great job of tying things in. And like I said earlier, it would have been easy for Dan Jurgens to just say, if you want to know what happens, go read such and such, but instead he allows us to learn as Superman and Lois Lane learn what's going on. Then what Lana Lang does is she says, of course, with this being the New 52 Lana Lang, is she says, when the New 52 Superman died and his solar flare went off, that Lana Lang and the New 52 Lois Lane were struck by his solar flare, and the result is that they both received a fraction of his power. In response to this, they both developed the powers of Superwoman. And this is why if you go pick up Superwoman #1, both the New 52 Lois Lane and the New 52 Lana Lang are both Superwomen. Now, the difference here is that the New 52 Lois Lane, actually, I talked to Sal over at Comic Pop about this because I had to kind of rehash this to make sure I understood it correctly. But from what he was telling me, the New 52 Lois Lane was the frontrunner Superwoman. She was the star of the show. But the problem was, with Lana Lang providing some background to that, you couldn't have two Superwomen being in the title because it wasn't titled Superwomen, it was titled Superwoman. And so one of them had to die. And the result is that the New 52 Lois Lane was completely incinerated. Now, Lana Lang doesn't immediately tell them this. Instead, Lois Lane goes to the laptop of her New 52 counterpart, punches in the password, and she gets a message. And what she's told is that when they were, when both the New 52 Lois Lane and the New 52 Lana Lang were hit with a solar flare of Superman, that the New 52 Lois Lane felt like things weren't right. She felt like her body was quite literally falling apart on the molecular level, on the atomic level. And even if she hadn't been incinerated, she would have died at some point or another relatively soon, which is really just Dan Jurgens saying, hey, Lana Lang was always going to be the Superwoman. Lois Lane, the New 52 Lois Lane, was never going to be Superwoman for long. It was a matter of time before she died. We just chose to have her incinerated in the first place. But the greatest thing about this, and this is why this little message is so beautifully written, is it's not just as simple as, hey, pre-New 52 Lois Lane, I know you exist, and I really need you to finish the paper that Perry Wright wrote me, or had me write. It was a lot more complicated than that. That with the New 52 Lois Lane dead, no one knows. No one at the Daily Planet knows, her father doesn't know, her friends don't know, no one is aware. And the New 52 Lois Lane starts crying and saying that her family needs closure, or they need to believe that she's still alive. They need to know what's going on, because right now they're just left in the dark. And the reason why this is so beautifully written is because the last bit of information that we had on Lois Lane was that she had outed the identity of the New 52 Superman to the world, which initiated the whole Superman Truth event. And so for us, she wasn't really a cruel person so much as she didn't really take the account of emotions of other people, you know, whenever she was making her decisions, or at least it didn't seem to be that way. But this tells us she's very much human. This tells us that the people around her are very important to who she is on a very, very fundamental level. And so at this point, of course, Lana Lang basically confirms, yes, the New 52 Superman is dead. She was vaporized, she's gone, and we're in a tough situation. The reason why is because they're faced with two choices. Either they can tell the world that Lois Lane is dead, or they cannot tell the world. Now, if they did tell the world that Lois Lane is dead and that Lois Lane's powers, the powers of the New 52 Superman had been split between Lois Lane and someone else, then people would start digging into the identity of Superwoman. They wouldn't simply just view her as a superhero. They would simply say, like, we need to know who she is. We need to find out what her identity is. And as a result, it could cause all different kinds of problems for her and the people that she knows. But all those concerns, all those issues can just be washed away. They can be pushed under the bridge, they can be hidden, swept under the carpet if the pre-New 52 Lois Lane undertakes the mantle of the New 52 Lois Lane. And that presents a really interesting scenario here because, for the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, this is not a decision that she makes lightly. She takes this into account, and her and Superman talk for hours trying to figure it out, because what it would mean is that she would literally begin communicating with a father that's not her own. She would pretend to be his daughter. She would pretend to be the friend of people that she doesn't know. She would basically be taking over an identity that's not her own. But despite the fact that they have this huge conversation, despite the fact that all this goes on and they're trying to figure it out, in the end, they settle on the decision of having the pre-New 52 Lois Lane become the New 52 Lois Lane, for the simple fact that their families are better off believing, or I guess the family of the New 52 Lois Lane is better off believing their daughter is alive as opposed to believing she's dead. At the same time, it's easier for the New 52 Lois Lane, or the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, to have a place in the DC landscape. Now, that's within the story. That's, what Dan Jurgens is doing, focusing on her character. With regards to the bigger picture, it's really just finding something to do with her, right? I mean, we couldn't have her sitting at home being the housewife forever, just because of the fact that people would want to see her character grow. They would want to see her character evolve. Not only that, when people think of Lois Lane, again, they don't think of the housewife, they think of the do what it takes, pull no punches, reporter that was modeled on Torchy Blaine from way back in the day. That's the Lois Lane they think of. That's the Lois Lane that we want. And so the result is that Dan Jurgens is giving us that. And that really hits at the heart of DC Rebirth, right? That really hits at the heart of this. It's taking what worked with the New 52 and combining it with what worked in the pre-New 52, merging them together to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what we're getting here. We're getting the pre-New 52 Lois Lane playing the role of the New 52 Lois Lane with the personality and the supporting cast of all the people that we've come to know and love. And so as this comic starts to wrap up, we of course see Lois Lane talking with Lex Luthor saying, I will do this report on you, I will do this interview, but I'm not gonna pull any punches. I'm going to ask you the same kind of questions that I would ask anybody else. And it's really just her solidifying her place as Lois Lane, working at the Daily Planet in the New 52 continuity. But we're also left with a bit of a cliffhanger. And this is why I like what Dan Jurgens is doing, is he's continuing a lot of these things. We have again the man in the red baseball cap who is just basically hanging out on the outskirts of Metropolis, and he seems to be in some kind of rock quarry of sorts, but he opens a portal, and from this portal emerges a character named Zayd. Now, I have no idea who this is, and for those of you guys who are very, very familiar with the pre-New 52, maybe you know, but I have been digging around, and I have not been able to find anything. So the indication to me is that Zayd is a wholly new creation, which is fine, because I'm excited to see where it goes. But the idea here is that this man in the baseball cap, alongside Zayd, seem to be enemies of Superman. Superman. For what reason, we don't know, but it looks like they're enemies of Superman and their goal seems to be to take him out, whether by killing him or taking him prisoner. But with that being said, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I really hope you guys are enjoying it. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button, become part of the Rob Corps. And if you guys are digging this whole Superman mythos right now in DC Rebirth, leave a comment down below and let me know, because I gotta tell you, this is some of the best damn storytelling that I have seen in comics for a long time. And I will catch you all later. Peace.